Hey everyone, welcome back to Creepy Mysteries. First off, a huge thank you to all of you for the amazing support you've shown so far. Your comments and likes mean a lot to me and keep this channel going. If you're new here, I'd love for you to stick around and join our mysterious journey. Don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts. It helps the channel grow and keeps the spooky stories coming. Now let's dive into today's stories. I moved into my first apartment in Harlem about a year ago. It was a typical New York apartment, small, a little run down, and barely in my budget. But I was excited. I had just moved from upstate and was finally ready to take on the city. The place was one of those walk-up buildings where you'd get your exercise just by going to your own front door. 5 stories, no elevator, and everything felt like it was from a different era. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and when I first saw it, I immediately liked it. The windows faced the street, and despite the usual noise from traffic and people yelling outside, I found a strange comfort in it. The floorboards creaked when you walked on them, and the paint was chipped in places, but it was mine. I was living the New York dream. At least that's how I tried to convince myself. I worked at a local cafe, pulling long hours for not much money, but it was the kind of job that made me feel like I was a part of something. My shifts often ended late, sometimes around midnight, and by the time I'd get back to my apartment, I'd be so exhausted that I just wanted to crash on the couch and fall asleep. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the noise. And not just any noise, the noise coming from the apartment above me. At first, it was just the usual sounds you'd expect from a building like this. I'd hear someone walking around late at night, maybe dragging something heavy across the floor. Sometimes the sound of things being knocked over, like furniture shifting. I didn't think too much of it. Old buildings make weird sounds, right? It was probably just the neighbors above me, who I'd never actually met. But as the weeks went by, the noises started to get more unnerving. It wasn't just random sounds anymore. There was something deliberate about it. The noises would start at the same time every night, usually around 10 p.m. It sounded like footsteps pacing back and forth, sometimes followed by muffled voices. Sometimes I'd hear a door slamming shut. Then it would go quiet for a while. It felt like whoever was above me was living out some kind of drama every single night. I was getting frustrated, especially since my work hours were exhausting. I remember one night, after a particularly long shift, I came home to hear it again. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking in circles. It wasn't just one person either. It sounded like multiple people, their footsteps overlapping. And that's when it started to freak me out. I tried knocking on the door above me one evening, but no one answered. I'd never actually seen the people who lived there, so I had no idea who was behind the noise. I went back downstairs and asked the building super about it the next day. He was an older man, always grumpy, and he barely looked up from his newspaper when I mentioned the noise. "You know how these old buildings are," he grumbled. "People walking around, doors slamming, pipes creaking. It's nothing unusual." But it was unusual. Something about the timing, the way it felt like there was someone intentionally trying to make noise at odd hours of the night. It didn't sit right with me. And the voices. I swear sometimes I could hear words, but they were muffled. And the footsteps. They didn't sound like regular footfalls. There was something off about them. Heavy, deliberate. One evening I decided to stay up late and try to catch whoever it was. I had a gut feeling that something was wrong. I set myself up on the couch in the living room, hoping to stay awake long enough to hear what was really going on. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of a loud bang. It was like a door slamming shut, followed by more footsteps. The sounds were so loud that they felt like they were coming from inside my own apartment. I got up, my heart pounding. I checked the locks on the door, then peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the noises continued. Footsteps again, moving toward my door. It was so strange. I stepped back, my hands shaking, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something through the crack in the door. Just a shadow moving across the floor of the hallway. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared. I stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, and this time I could feel my heart racing. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was stuck in place, as if some invisible force was keeping me from opening the door. And then there was a knock. Just one. Soft but firm, like someone expected me to open up. But I didn't. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. The footsteps stopped. The knocking stopped. I stood there in the dark, barely breathing, listening for anything, but it was silent. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next day I went back to the building super. This time I was a little more insistent. "Who lives in that apartment above me?" I asked. "Why does it sound like someone is always up there?" He shrugged again, not looking up from his paper. "I think it's empty now, kid. Been vacant for a while." My stomach sank. "Empty? Then who's making the noise?" He looked up for the first time, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean? I haven't heard anything." But I knew what I heard. I'd heard it almost every night. It wasn't just the usual noise you'd expect from an old building. It felt intentional, like something was trying to make me uncomfortable. And now, knowing that the apartment was vacant, it didn't make sense. The following week, I decided to confront it. I waited for the usual sounds to start, those slow, deliberate footsteps, followed by the muffled voices, but nothing came. I sat in the dark, listening. My apartment felt cold, as if it was trying to keep something from me. Then I heard it, the sound of a phone ringing, but it wasn't my phone. It wasn't even a phone I recognized. It was the sound of an old rotary phone, the kind you only see in movies or in antique shops. It echoed from above, loud and clear, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew something was wrong. I called the landlord the next morning. He assured me that everything was fine, that the building was perfectly safe. But when I asked him again about the noise and whether anyone had been living in the apartment above, he hesitated. "Look," he said, "I'll send someone over to check it out. But there's no one there. Trust me." I don't know what happened that day, but after that, the noise stopped. No more footsteps, no more knocking, no more phone ringing. The apartment felt normal again, but the eerie silence was almost worse. A few weeks later, I got a new neighbor on the floor below me. We exchanged pleasantries, but I never told them what had happened in that building. I moved out not long after, deciding to find a place that felt a little more peaceful. I still don't know what the source of the noise was, or why it happened. I don't know if it was something supernatural or just my imagination playing tricks on me. But every time I hear an old rotary phone ring, my heart stops for a second. What if it rings again? What if the footsteps start again? And what if they're still there, waiting for someone else to hear them? When I first moved into my apartment in the East Village, it felt like a dream. The rent was cheaper than I'd expected, and the location was perfect. I had a small studio on the second floor of an old building with creaky floors and thin walls, but it had character. I was finally living in the city on my own. It was everything I wanted until things started to feel off. The apartment was cozy, with just enough space for my bed, a small couch, and a TV. There was one feature that I loved, the big, old-fashioned mirror that hung on the wall next to my bed. It had a brass frame, something you'd probably find in a thrift store, but it added a touch of charm to the room. I thought it was perfect, but I quickly learned that mirrors in old buildings have a way of making you feel like you're not alone. At first, everything was normal. I'd get home late from work, watch TV, and fall asleep without giving much thought to the mirror. But over time, I began noticing something strange. Whenever I'd pass by it in the middle of the night, there was this weird feeling, like I was being watched. I know it sounds silly, but the reflection just didn't seem to match what was happening in the room. One night, after a particularly long shift, I came home and walked into the studio, tired and ready to crash. As usual, I passed by the mirror on my way to the bed, and I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I paused, staring into the reflection. For a split second, I saw a figure standing behind me. It wasn't my reflection. It was someone else, a man, standing in the dark, just out of sight. He was tall with dark hair, wearing a long coat. But when I turned around, there was nothing there, just the empty room. I shook it off, telling myself I was just overtired. It was probably just a trick of the light, right? But the feeling didn't go away. Over the next few nights, I began seeing the same figure in the reflection. I'd walk by the mirror, catch a glimpse of him in the corner of my eye, and then turn around quickly. Nothing. Every time the figure was gone. One evening, I decided to do a little experiment. I came home, grabbed my phone, and set it up to record. I wanted to catch whatever was going on with the mirror. It was a stupid idea, but I was curious. I set the phone in front of the mirror, turned it on, and then stood in front of it. I waited and waited. After a few minutes, I started feeling that same uncomfortable feeling, like someone was standing behind me. I turned around slowly, but there was no one there, just the empty space behind me. Still, the feeling lingered. I looked back at the phone screen and saw it. There, in the reflection. The man, the same tall figure, standing behind me, as if he was just waiting. I froze. My stomach dropped. I immediately stopped the recording and watched it again, but there was no doubt. The man was standing right behind me, looking at me through the mirror, even though I hadn't seen him in the room when I turned around. I could feel my heart racing. There was no way this was just a coincidence. I ran to the door, locked it, and sat on the couch, too shaken to move. The figure never moved in the reflection. It just stood there, staring at me, motionless. And then, just when I thought I might lose it, the reflection in the mirror changed. The man's face twisted into a grin, a cold, menacing grin. It was subtle, but it was there. I could feel his eyes on me through the mirror, even though I wasn't looking directly at it anymore. It felt like he was somehow inside the room, even though I knew he wasn't. My whole body was on edge. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police, right? Who would believe me? "Oh, officer, there's a man in my mirror who isn't actually in the room." It sounded insane, so I just kept it to myself. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I passed the mirror, I felt that cold presence behind me. Every time I lay in bed, I could almost feel his eyes on me, even with my back turned. Then came the worst part. I was getting ready for work one morning, just another normal day when I passed the mirror, and there he was, standing right in front of me in the reflection. But this time he wasn't standing still. He was moving, slowly. He raised his hand as if to wave. I froze. I didn't dare move. I didn't even want to blink. But then, he waved. I backed away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff, ran out of the apartment, and didn't look back. That day, I went to the landlord and demanded to know everything about the building. I found out that the place had been around for decades, and that several tenants had reported strange occurrences in the past. Some of them had even mentioned feeling like they were being watched, like something was lurking in the reflections of mirrors. But no one had ever talked about it in detail, and the landlord didn't seem to think it was anything to worry about. I moved out that same week. I couldn't stay there any longer. Not with that mirror watching me, not with that man standing behind me every night. I never even told anyone about the man in the reflection. Who would believe me? The whole thing felt insane, but I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. I haven't been able to look into another mirror the same way since. The worst part? Every time I pass by a reflective surface now, whether it's a mirror, a window, or even a shiny car door, I can't help but wonder, is he still there? Watching me, waiting for the next moment to appear, just out of the corner of my eye? I just hope he's not following me. Moving to New York had always been a dream of mine. After years of saving and planning, I finally found an affordable apartment in Washington Heights. The building was nothing special, an older 6-story structure with faded bricks, creaky staircases, and an ancient elevator that rattled uncomfortably. My apartment, 4B, was surprisingly spacious for the price, with large windows overlooking the street and hardwood floors that felt worn but solid. The day I moved in, I noticed something strange. One of the doors in the apartment was locked. It wasn't a closet or a utility room. It looked like it led to another small section of the apartment. I assumed it might be a maintenance room that wasn't part of my rental space, but it felt odd that the landlord hadn't mentioned it. When I called to ask, the landlord brushed it off quickly. "Oh, that's just an old storage space. It's been sealed up for years. Nothing you need to worry about." His tone was dismissive, almost hurried, and I figured it wasn't worth pressing further. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I settled into a routine: work during the day, come home, eat dinner, and watch TV before bed. But it wasn't long before I started noticing strange things. It began with faint noises coming from behind the locked door. At first, I chalked it up to the building settling, or maybe pipes clanging, but then the sounds became more distinct. Soft thuds like something heavy being dropped, and occasionally what sounded like scratching. I told myself it was nothing, but the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it seemed to get. One night, while lying in bed, I heard what sounded like whispering coming from behind the door. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. I froze, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. By the next morning, I'd convinced myself it was all in my head. I was probably just stressed from work and adjusting to a new city. But then, things started to escalate. One evening, as I was watching TV, I heard a loud bang from behind the locked door. It sounded like someone had thrown something against it. I jumped up, my heart racing, and stared at the door. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. There was no response. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord again. "Hey, I'm hearing noises from behind the locked door in my apartment. Are you sure it's just a storage room?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. "Like I said, it's been sealed up for years. There's nothing back there." He hung up before I could press further. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard movement from behind the door. Soft footsteps, faint whispers, the sound of something brushing against the wood. The next day, I decided to try and figure out what was going on. I inspected the door more closely. It was old with paint chipping around the edges, and the lock was rusted. I tried to wiggle the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then I noticed something odd, faint scratches near the bottom of the door, as if someone or something had been clawing at it. Feeling uneasy, I decided to leave for the afternoon. When I returned that evening, something felt different. As I stepped into the apartment, I noticed a strange smell, musty, like damp wood mixed with something metallic. I walked into the living room and froze. The locked door was open. It was only open a crack, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I stood there, staring, unsure of what to do. I hadn't touched the door, and I was certain it had been locked when I left. Slowly, I walked over and pushed it open. The room beyond was small and dark, with no windows. The air was heavy and smelled stale, like it hadn't been ventilated in years. The walls were bare except for deep gouges running vertically, like claw marks. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, tilted slightly, and what looked like dried stains on the floor beneath it. Suddenly, I heard a loud creak behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I backed out of the room, shutting the door quickly, and grabbed my phone to call the landlord again. This time, he didn't answer. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lights on and tried to tell myself it was just an old abandoned room. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong with it. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My stomach dropped. I knew I'd closed it before going to bed. Slowly, I sat up and looked toward the doorway. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, I saw a figure standing in the hall. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs. Its face was pale and featureless, and its head was tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. I couldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and that was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I grabbed my phone and bolted out of the apartment, not even bothering to grab my shoes. I ran down the stairs and out into the street where I called the police. When they arrived, they searched the apartment but found nothing. The locked door was closed again, and there was no sign of anyone else in the apartment. The officers told me it was probably a break-in and suggested I stay somewhere else for the night. I never went back to that apartment. I broke my lease and moved out the next week. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what was behind that door, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint scratching in my dreams. That's for today from Creepy Mysteries. Hope you enjoyed the stories. If you enjoyed the stories and want more tales that send chills down your spine, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And remember, the scariest stories are often the ones that feel a little too real. Until next time, stay safe and stay in the light.